若手研究者を成功に導くことは大学・研究機関の大きな責任です。フォルテのトレーニングセミナーは全く新しいメソッドを用い、若手研究者のスキルアップをサポートいたします。
日本でセミナーと聞いて人々が思い浮かべるのは講義、つまり着席した受講者に対し講師が一方的に話すスタイルです。講義形式ではセミナー受講者が何を学ぶことができたか、講師側も受講者自身も把握できませんでした。そこでフォルテはセミナーの形式を参加型へ変更しました。
まず特定のトピックについて30分程度の短いレクチャーを行います。その後受講者はシステムにログインし、いくつかのクイズにオンライン上で回答します。クイズ回答後には正解者と不正解者の割合や最も正答率が低かった問題をスクリーンに表示します。正答率が低い問題に戻り、もう一度これらのポイントについて解説することにより、受講者全員が内容を理解できるようになります。こうしたインタラクティブ形式を採用することで、受講者一人一人の理解度を記録することが可能になりました。さらに受講者は受け身の聞き手として参加するのではなく、セミナーのプロセスに組み込まれることになるため、より集中することができると考えます。何よりもこの参加するセミナーには受講者の心を捉えて離さない魅力があります。
楽しかったです。クイズすごく、はい、なんかフォーカスもクイズが挟まることで集中も続いたので、セミナー通して楽しめました。
内容が分かりやすかったのと、あとお話がゆっくり話していただいたので、大変理解度も高かったと思います。
フォルテのセミナーに参加された多くの受講者の方たちから、今までのセミナーとは全く違う、学ぶことのできる有意義なセミナー、楽しみながら学べるセミナーなどの声をいただいています。
世界トップレベルの研究者育成を30年以上にわたりサポートしてきた専門家のフォルテにぜひお任せください。
My name is Greg Adams, and I am the managing editor of FORTE Science Communications. And today I'm going to be giving a webinar on common language errors that are present in manuscripts written by authors who are writing in their second language. So the purpose of today's seminar is to give you some real valuable information that is based on FORTE's 30 years of experience. FORTE is Japan's leading science communications company, and we help thousands of scientists just like you every year to write manuscripts and publish in academic journals. And hopefully today's seminar will give you some information that will help you when you are writing and submitting your own manuscripts. So the goals of today's seminar, there are three. The first is, as I mentioned, we want to identify three types of language errors. And we also want to give some real examples of each of these errors so that you can become more able to identify them in your own writing. And finally, the overall goal is that the information we provide you today is going to improve your chances of publication. So before I begin and talk about some of the specific errors, I want to give you an important note that you should keep in mind. So obvious errors in your manuscript can stop your submission before your manuscript reaches the review stage. So it's very important for you to think about the most critical components of your submission. The number one most critical component is obviously the title. And next is the abstract. And finally, your cover letter. And the reason that these are so critical is that often in busy journals, these are the only parts of your submission that are read initially when you submit. So if there is an error in your title, your abstract, or your cover letter, this can slow down your submission. The journal may send your manuscript back to you, or they may simply reject your submission because they don't believe that you have taken the right care and attention in preparing your text. So for all of the errors that I talk about today, the most important place to address them is going to be in these critical areas. So as I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about language errors. And overall, there are many types of language errors, but today we are going to try and focus on 3 of the most common types of language errors. So the first type of error is going to be grammar errors. And I'm sure that most of you are very concerned about English grammar and the difficulty of writing in English. So let's look at some of the common grammar errors. The first most common grammar error is what we call subject-verb agreement. And this is obviously where the sentence does not include agreement between the subject and the verb. As an example, this is a piece of text from a real manuscript. So this author has written, anodized wafers were rinsed in deionized water. So the subject, wafers, is plural. So as a result, the verb, were, is also plural. They're in agreement. This same information could also be written as each anodized wafer was rinsed in deionized water. So because the subject now has changed to single wafer, it's essential to change the verb to was. Similarly, a sentence like diffusion coefficients have been calculated for each model. Here, this is using the plural form of the verb, have been, because the subject is coefficients, plural. Again, the same information can be written this way. A diffusion coefficient has been calculated for each model. So whenever you're writing, it's very important for you to think about the plural or singular of your subject and ensure that you are matching your verb to that case. And as a bonus point, today I will mention that in academic writing, the word data, which is used very, very often, is plural. So you're always going to want to match data with a plural verb. So for example, the data show that, or data were analyzed by. In more common English speaking, people tend to use data as singular, but it is actually a plural word. And so in academic writing, we should really focus on getting the right verb. In this case, show or were. Another major area of difficulty for authors in terms of grammar errors is the use of prepositions. Prepositions are obviously the small words that are included with verbs to make the sentence grammatically correct. They can also slightly change the nuance of the sentence as well. One common problem that we see with authors writing in a second language is with the specific use of the preposition between. So here is a sentence that is correct. No significant difference between the BH1 and BH2 sites was observed. So this is a correct sentence. And the author has correctly used between because we are talking about two sites, BH1 and BH2. However, if the author wants to talk about three sites, BH1, BH2, and BH3, then it can no longer use between, and the sentence must now use among. So we use between for two comparisons and among for multiple comparisons. In this case, 3, but it could be for 4 or 5 or 6 factors. And as an example of a preposition that can change the meaning of the sentence or the nuance of the sentence, here is a very common type of construction. Measurements were collected at 1 hour. And this would be in contrast to measurements were collected for 1 hour. So obviously the first sentence is talking about one time, whereas the second sentence is talking about the length of time. So that is a major difference in the nuance. So you're going to want to check the use of prepositions to ensure that you are giving the correct nuance in each of your sentences. So another common grammar error that we see is with hyphenation. And hyphens are obviously the small dashes or small lines that are used to connect words. And it's very difficult for people to understand how to use them because the same words can be written with the hyphen and without the hyphen. So people wonder, how do I know? So this example says the filament was 10 millimeters long. And this is grammatically correct. There's no problem with this English. But the same information can be written as using a 10 millimeter filament. So in this case, 10 millimeters now describes the filament. So it's essential to use the hyphen. Similarly, if we were to write, interviewees were all 35 years old, this would be grammatically correct. But if we change the order of the sentence, for example, interviewees of 35-year-old scientists revealed, the position of 35-year-old now requires the hyphens, as that describes scientists. So when you're writing, you should always be looking at what words are used to describe in the sentence to determine if a hyphen is necessary. And as a bonus, I'd like to add today, so when you're writing your manuscript, usually you're going to write numbers as digits, but occasionally it is necessary for you to write them in word form. And it is necessary to use hyphens in many of these numbers. And the style is consistent from 21 all the way to 99. So regardless of whether you are writing 37 or 55 or 92, you're always going to connect those words with a single hyphen. So we've talked about common grammar errors that we see as a type of language error. And now I'd like to move into a different type of error. This is what we would call word choice errors. And one of the most difficult words for many authors to use correctly is the word respectively. So let's look at an example sentence. This sentence says the values were 176 millimeters and 198 millimeters respectively. So this looks like a reasonable sentence, but this sentence is incorrect. So let's look at this second example now. This sentence is correct. This uses respectively in an appropriate way. The values for the AC powered device and the DC powered device were 176 millimeters and 198 millimeters respectively. So why is this sentence different? Both have respectively at the end. Well, why is the second one correct, but the first one not correct? So let me use some color to demonstrate. So respectively here is used to connect the data with the relevant words in the sentence. So for example, AC powered devices, the data is 176 millimeters. And DC powered devices, the data is 198 millimeters. So by using respectively now, we can link those together. The first sentence does not include anything to link. There's no linkage, there's no connection. So the use of respectively is not necessary and in fact, confusing. So if you are ever in a case where you are trying to list 3 items and 3 data points, that is a case where you would want to use respectively. So always check the structure of the sentence carefully to confirm that it is appropriate. So another difficult word for many authors to use is relatively. So again, let's look at a sentence here. The proposed method has relatively high resolution. Now, technically, this sentence is grammatically correct. There's really not a problem with the structure of the sentence. Unfortunately, scientists like to be very specific, and they like their language to be very clear and efficient. And this use here is unclear because there is no comparison. The purpose of relatively is unclear. So what would be an example of a sentence with the use of relatively that is clear or easily understood? Here's a good example. The proposed method has a relatively high resolution of 0.001 nanometers, which is an order of magnitude higher than conventional methods such as. Okay, that's a very long and complicated sentence. So let me use some color to show. So the first sentence only says relatively high. But the second sentence now says higher than conventional methods, such as. So the comparison in the second sentence is very clear. So if you are ever going to use the term relatively, remember to include essential detail like is included in this second sentence. And another word choice error that we often see is what I like to call vague terms. Now, obviously, vague is referring to terms that are unclear in meaning and don't provide enough detail. So similar to the previous slide where we talked about the comparison being unclear and scientists liking the text to be specific and detailed, the use of vague terms goes against that way of thinking. So the most famous example of a vague term is etc. And whenever possible, I always recommend to try to eliminate the use of etc. So in this sentence, we have are important in medicine, optics, computing, etc. So we can understand the author's nuance. We know what the author is trying to demonstrate using etc. But for academic writing, we should really try to improve this sentence. So how can we improve that? So we can change the order of the sentence, and we can use a phrase like such as. So are important in fields such as medicine, optics, and computing. So in this case, we keep that feeling that there are many others by using such as, but we take away the vagueness by making this an inclusive list. So this is a much stronger way of writing. Another example, some people might try to eliminate etc. using an alternative phrase. For example, this sentence uses among others. So something has been observed in the Bismarck, Cortland, and Empire cultivars, among others. So once again, we can understand the nuance that the author is trying to portray. We can understand the meaning of the sentence, but we can write this in a better way. We can make this stronger if we change the sentence such as this. Has been observed in several cultivars, including Bismarck, Cortland, and Empire. So again, the information contained in the sentence is the same, but the writing is stronger and clearer. And that is something that scientists are always trying to do with their writing, is to write clearly and accurately. And the next word choice error is really related to what I would call unnecessary words. That's one of the key characteristics of academic writing, is that the text tends to be what I would call tight. It eliminates unnecessary words that generally we see in written English. So in certain cases, it's always better to use shorter phrasing when you're writing your manuscripts. So here are some very, very common examples of ways that you can write in a more concise way that eliminates unnecessary words. So for example, you can go from as a result of 4 words, all the way down to consequently, just 1 word. Or the majority of, you can just write as most. At this point in time, you could write as now or currently. Due to the fact that is more simply written as because. With the exception of, we can shrink that down all the way to except. Or it is possible that, we can write that as may. At the same time as, concurrently. And in light of the fact that, we can say as since. So we go from 6 words all the way down to 1. Now, I'm sure some of you are looking at this list and you're thinking, why does it matter Why is it important to go from 4 words to 1 word or 3 words to 1 word? And in response, I would simply like to remind you that journals often have very, very strict character limits or word limits for things like the title and the abstract in particular. So if you spend several hours writing your abstract or thinking of a very effective title for your manuscript, and then you go to the submission website and find out that it is slightly too long, small changes in language and eliminating unnecessary words are going to help you to reach that limit, but also include the nuance that you're trying to include. One of the most painful situations for any author is to write an abstract and then have to find 5 words or 10 words to eliminate. It can be very, very difficult and very stressful. But if you just look for what we would call unnecessary words, these are places that you can make small changes that will have a big impact on your submission. And the final type of word choice error is what I like to call close words. Now, these are words that sometimes are spelled very similarly, or they sound very similar. And so they're very easy for people to mistake when they're typing. And even more difficult is that they are hard to find when you are reading the text. So whenever you are doing your final check of your manuscript, as I said, specifically your title and your abstract and your cover letter, you're going to want to give a critical eye to the words that you use to make sure that you haven't made a very simple mistake that introduces the wrong word. So a good example is a word like staff. If you are, for example, writing about hospital staff, if you accidentally type stuff, it will not be recognized as a spelling error because stuff is a true word. But in the context of your manuscript, it's the wrong word. Another example might be for a medical paper, would be rupture. Just one small change in letter, you get rapture, which again is a correct word in English, but in the context of a medical research paper would never ever be appropriate. Now, this is a word that is specifically difficult for Japanese authors. We have region and lesion. Now, these words are spelled very differently, but because of the pronunciation in Japanese, it is very easy for authors to confuse these 2 words. And in a medical paper, for example, these 2 words might both be appropriate. So it would be very difficult to recognize that this was incorrect without carefully thinking about the context of that sentence. And finally, another word like fetal and fatal. Again, very, very similar spellings, and even could both be used in the same manuscript, but the meanings are obviously very, very different. So you'll have to decide which one is correct based on the context of your sentence. So this is just a list of 4 potential errors that someone could introduce to their manuscript. There could be hundreds or thousands of similar cases like this. So it's always important to check based on the context of your research and the vocabulary used in your research, and make sure that you're not introducing close words that don't fit the context of your paper. So the final type of language error that we're going to talk about today is what I would refer to as style and formatting problems. So these are problems that are, again, related to the language, but also connect very closely to style and format of your journal. The first one that comes up, and this is, again, a very common error for Japanese authors, is the use of non-English characters when typing. So, of course, when I say non-English characters, people wonder what does that mean? So let me give you an example on this screen. So if you read this sentence, samples stored at -20 degrees Celsius or -70 degrees Celsius for 1, 6, and 12 months, okay, we can read this sentence. And on our screens at the moment, it doesn't look like there is any problem. But if you look very closely at the degree Celsius symbol, you can see that the letter C is actually a different font than the other letters in the sentence. And this is because the degree Celsius symbol used in this sentence is in Japanese. For us, this is really not a problem because we can read the sentence and we can see the character. However, when you submit your text to a journal or to a conference, the person who opens your file or looks at your text may not have Japanese character compatibility. They may only see a box, or they may see a blank, or they may see a totally different character. We don't know. So it's always essential to have the English language character used in your text to avoid these difficulties. And the problem can be not only when somebody opens the file and reads the text, but at academic journals, text is uploaded in a Word document or LaTeX file, and then converted to a PDF file for the reviewer. And this conversion from one format to another is where some of these symbols can become lost or changed. So the safest way to avoid these problems is to type your characters in an English font. So here is another example. And I hope that it's easy for you to see in this sentence, the less than symbol. So we have P less than 0.02. You can see it's slightly different. It's thinner and a little bit larger. This is a non-English font. So that character should be replaced with the appropriate English character. And I think these two examples that I've shown here demonstrate that you can recognize these characters with your eyes. By simply looking at your text after you've typed, you should be able to see some fonts are slightly large or thin or not sitting on the line correctly. And you will be able to recognize immediately, this is not the right font. This is not the right character. And as a bonus, since we are talking about the importance of spacing and fonts, and specifically in this case, we are talking about units, I wanted to remind everyone of the importance of including a space between numbers and units. And again, this is another problem that we see quite often for Japanese authors. So these are three examples of correctly formatted numbers and units. So we have 27.5 kilograms, there's a space. We have 890 cubic centimeters, again, a space between the number and the unit, and finally 3 milliliters. So it's quite common for authors to type their numbers with the units touching, but it's always essential to include that space between them. So again, when you are giving your text the final read before you submit to the journal, always double check your data and your units to make sure that there is a space. And the next style or format problem that we see refers to the table and figure order in your manuscript. So basically, every manuscript submitted to a journal is going to include at least one table or one figure. And in most cases, people are going to be submitting with several tables or multiple figures. So it is incredibly important to remember that you must cite your figures and tables in order. So very simply put, if you talk about figure 1 and figure 2 in your manuscript, you must describe figure 1 before figure 2 in your manuscript. And if you are writing your manuscript and you find that you must refer to figure 2 before figure 1, then you should really consider renumbering your figures. And this rule is quite specific because it is not only essential to refer to your figures and tables in order, but even the panels in your figures should be described in order. So some of you may have large figures that have several parts, A, B, C, and D. You're going to have to discuss figure 1A before you discuss figure 1B. And another major style or format problem is with in-text citations. The foundation of any manuscript that you are submitting to an academic journal is going to be the references. So every paper will have in-text citations. And most commonly, your citations will be in numerical order. I understand that there are some journals that require the author name and year of publication. And if that is the style used by your journal, then please use that style. But most commonly, citations will be in numerical order. But numerical order requires you to cite the text or cite the reference in the text in the correct order. So for example, reference 7 must be cited before reference 8. And that applies for all your citations. And again, if you find that as you are writing your manuscript, you must cite reference 8 before reference 7, then you're going to want to change the order of your citations and the order of your list of references at the end of the manuscript. But perhaps more difficult to understand for many authors is that your citations must follow the style of your target journal. And again, we're talking now mostly about journals that have numbered citations. But numbered citations can be in several different formats. So these 3 separate formats, we have square brackets, we have superscript with parentheses, or we have simply superscript only. These 3 styles are all correct for different journals. So you're going to want to check the style that is required for your journal and make sure that you apply that consistently throughout the text. And one thing to keep in mind is that not only the style of the citations is important, but also the location. So for example, if you look at the first citation, which was within square brackets, some journals will specify that it must be placed after the punctuation. So again, checking to see where it is required is based on the journal's instructions to authors. Similarly, this journal might require the superscript number in parentheses to be placed after punctuation. And here is another example. This one is, again, after the punctuation. So please check the instructions to authors of your target journal very carefully, and even remember these small, subtle differences, because journals will be looking at this to see if you have followed their instructions to authors carefully. And the final style and format problem that we often see is what I will call just simply inconsistencies. And the first type of inconsistency is regarding abbreviations. Science writing is very famous for using abbreviations: DNA, RNA, MRI. And it is necessary to define all abbreviations at the first use in the abstract and again in the manuscript. So for example, time of flight mass spectrometry. We will use that first and put the abbreviation in brackets. And then later, we will use only the abbreviation. And if you start to mix writing out the full word and using the abbreviation, it's going to be very confusing for the reviewer. So he or she may point out that this needs to be made consistent. And another type of inconsistency that people must be aware of is with regards to manufacturer or model or developer information for things like instruments and software. So you must provide this information in your manuscript. And it's often done in this way. For example, Agilent Technologies, comma, and giving the location Santa Clara, California. But it's important to remember that this level of detail is only necessary the first time. Once you have introduced Agilent Technologies, the second time in your manuscript, it's only necessary to write Agilent Technologies with no location information. So this is an inconsistency that we often see from editors or writers working in their second language. So let me do a very, very brief review of the topics that we covered today, just as a reminder for you. I said that there were 3 major types of language errors. And the first one was grammar errors. And we looked at 3 types. And the second one was word choice errors. There were 5 types of word choice errors. And finally, we looked at style and format problems that we often see. So the goals of today's seminar were to identify these 3 types of language errors, which we have done, and to give you real examples of each type, which we have done. And finally, we want to improve your chances of publication. And right now, I can't say whether we have done that or not, because you are going to have to use this information when you are writing your next manuscript. but I hope that the information in today's seminar was helpful, and I do hope that it will help you to improve your chances of publication. So I would like to thank you all for your attention. It has been my pleasure speaking with you today, and I hope that the information contained in today's seminar has been very helpful, and I wish you the best of luck with your upcoming submission. And we now have some time for a brief Q&A session. So if anyone has any questions, if you could please type your questions in English using the chat function of the webinar software, then I will answer some of your questions right now. And any remaining questions, if we don't have time, I will try to get back to you by email later. Okay, so somebody is now asking a question about the use of the data are. Okay. So the first question is about using the word data. So is it necessary to include the data, the word the at the beginning? And as I mentioned in the seminar, scientists tend to write in a very tight style, and they like to eliminate unnecessary words. So actually both styles are correct. You can say the data are presented as, or data are presented as. Both would be fine. The main point for me would be to use it consistently throughout the text. If you are going to refer to the data, please use the in all instances in the text. And if you are going to refer only to data, data are presented as, or data were analyzed, then it's not necessary to include the if you are consistent all the way through. Okay, thank you very much for your question. I hope that's helpful. Any other questions? Okay, all right, we have our second question now is about English fonts. Yeah, so I mentioned that using the English character rather than a Japanese character is very important, but how can I find the correct English character? So the first place to look would be in your software. Look under the symbol font, and you can pull that up in Microsoft Word, and you can find the symbol in there, and you can insert it using the symbol font, and that will be read by computers, any computer using Microsoft software in the world. The other option would be if it's not a common symbol, maybe perhaps a mathematical symbol or a letter from another language, I think it's very helpful to go to Wikipedia, for example, or another website that displays the character. And if you copy it from the website and paste it into your document, that will often give you the correct English version of that character. And finally, I think one of the final ways that you can enter an English character is using what are called keyboard shortcuts. And if you look for keyboard shortcuts, for example, on the internet, you can find a list, and they will tell you by pushing, for example, one key and typing 784, then you can easily insert that correct format character into your manuscript. So that, again, that was keyboard shortcuts. Okay, so somebody is asking now, I mentioned when we were talking about symbols, the Japanese symbol. So somebody wants to know how to express one specific symbol. The name of that symbol is plus minus. We call that the plus minus symbol. So for example, the mean weight was 10 kilograms plus minus 2.3 kilograms. So plus minus. And again, similar, if it is in Japanese font, please try to replace it with an English character. And another question is, should I add the with an abbreviation? Well, that is a very, very good question. And I think it depends on the type of abbreviation. So for example, if you're using an abbreviation like a word, for example, AIDS, usually we don't add the, unless we are talking about, for example, the AIDS patients or the AIDS treatment. If you were talking about something that is a tool like MRI, then again, it might be necessary, but it's going to depend on the context of the sentence. I know that's maybe not a very clear answer for you, but sometimes it's very difficult to know whether it's a good idea to include the if you don't understand the specific location in the sentence. But in general, it's not necessary. Okay, and I think we have maybe time for one more question. So somebody has asked now about figures and tables. So yes, I mentioned when you are citing your figures and tables, yes, you must talk about figure 1 first before you talk about figure 2. Okay, so the question is, can I talk about figures and tables and mixing the order? So for example, do I have to talk about table 1 and then figure 1 and then table 2 and then figure 2? No. It is only necessary to talk about figures in the order and tables in the order. You can go between figures and tables. So you can talk about figure 1, figure 2, figure 3, and then table 1, figure 4. That is perfectly acceptable. So there is no concern with mixing the two, as long as you are consistent within figures and consistent within tables. So I hope that answers your question. So thank you all very, very much for attending our webinar. I hope the information that we shared today was helpful, and look forward to working with you again on our upcoming webinar in the future. Thank you very, very much.